Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank After, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. I am very pleased to have with us a man who has been contributing mightily from a variety of vantage points of late to the war of ideas aspect of that battle space, at the very least. He is Ambassador Michael Oren, the former U.S. citizen turned Israeli ambassador to the United States, now a member of the Knesset, and the author of a best-selling book, indeed a barn-burning best-selling book, entitled Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. A timely book indeed, as we're at the moment at the end game of what the administration claims is its effort to conclude a deal with the Iranians on nuclear weapons, some of which it would seem have Israel's name on them. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. It is a delight to have a chance to talk with you, and congratulations on the publication of your new book and its very considerable success.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you, Frank.
I'd like to sort of begin with how we got here. You have done some almost psychoanalytic delving into the Obama mind and what opened it to the Muslim world and seemingly closed it to Israel. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, and so he closed it to Israel. It had a different worldview about Israel, which is very important to note. There's a part of the book where I talk about how I, as a former historian, came into an embassy in 2009, and I was working with a new administration with a president who wasn't well known. He hadn't been in public life that long, and it felt it was my duty to study him the way I would study an historical subject, to go back to the sources, to go back to the text. So I read everything he wrote about the Middle East, everything he was interviewed about the Middle East, things he particularly the books he wrote about himself. And you didn't have to speculate very much because he said a tremendous amount. He always talked about his deep connections to the Middle East, deep connections to the Muslim world, what he called the Muslim world. And people tend to forget today that even in the first inaugural address, his first interview on television was Al Arabiya television. His first trips abroad to Turkey and Egypt, he always talked about these family ties and how they influenced him. And it's kind of interesting now because I've been rather attacked for this. But I'm just quoting what he said. And by the way, there's another section of the book where I do a profile of Netanyahu, and I use the same methodology with him. I talk about the influence of his father, the influence of his brother. And this is the ambassador's job. I understand that the issue of the president's connections to his Muslim family have become controversial in the United States. But they weren't controversial in 2009, and he was quite proud of them. It just sort of fell off over the years. But that doesn't remove me from the responsibility, certainly as an author who's recounting contemporary history, to talk about the process that I used in order to get to a point where I say in the book I would never be surprised by him. And it was largely successful.
And in the cumulative analysis that you've done, did you find an explanation for what amounts to, it seems to me at least, a kind of switching of sides in what's been called the war on terrorism? I think of it, as I said, as the war for the free world, because I really think that's what's on the line. Is it this sort of a nostalgic, sentimental attachment to Islam, or is there a notion of grand strategy that involves Iranian hegemony being a good thing and it being even a nuclear bomb-equipped hegemony at that?
Well, I won't sign on to the Obama switch sides thesis, and I say in the book again and again that I don't think he's anti-Israel. I think he's pro-Israel, though a certain type of Israel. Particularly the Israel that he thinks existed before 1967. Again, he has said this, and I personally think that Israel's a lot more liberal and democratic today than it was before 1967. But leaving that aside, again, the part about the Muslim family ties was a very small part of the research. Most of the research talked about, delved into Obama's academic background. Now, I've spent a lot of time on American campuses, and I knew the ideas that have been floating in American campuses for the last 30, 40 years. And many of the policies that the president embraced were not very surprising for me because I knew them. I knew them from the classroom. So what were they? No longer would America be the policeman of the world, the leader of the world. America would work in a collegial fashion with other powers. America would work with international organizations like the UN, and there's a tremendous emphasis on international organizations, including the Human Rights Council of the UN, which George Bush boycotted. He withdrew America's ambassador from the Human Rights Commission, and Obama returned America's. We thought that an American presence there would lend legitimacy to what is inherently a rabidly anti-Israel body of the UN. It meant a certain recoiling from the use of military power, much less emphasis on the use of military power. Obama said publicly, again, I quote him, whether we like it or not, we're the world's leading military power, which I think says an awful amount. I think it's a great window into his thinking. All of these were part of worldviews that I understood very well from campuses, and you could trace them. And he taught and studied at urban universities where these ideas were the dominant ideas. And here they were put into action as policy. Many of them have collided with reality, particularly after the winter of 2011 and the Arab Spring, when the Middle East, as we had come to know it over the previous century, simply unraveled.
I guess I'd like to just ask in our closing minutes, Ambassador Michael Oren, what you make of the deal now shaping up with Iran, and how those who have an attachment not only to the security of this country but also to Israel should be viewing it through the prism of a much more realistic attitude than the president has struck.
Well, as you know, I am a member of Knesset, Frank, and I represent a certain party. But what's the most remarkable thing here is that in a parliamentary body where representatives agree on just about nothing, where the parties agree on just about nothing, here there's almost a national consensus that this is a very bad deal, and it's a bad deal that jeopardizes our security, our safety, and perhaps even our future.
And in light of that, what should be done, in your judgment?
Measures should be taken that bring the Iranians back to the table, that ramps up the pressure on them, both economic pressure and a credible military threat, that will bring about a better deal. The administration's position has been very binary. It's either you have negotiations or war. But I think it's a false dichotomy. There's, of course, another alternative, and that is more negotiations for a better deal. And the Iranians have proven that when you do turn up, the pressure on them, you ramp up the pressure, they will be willing to make concessions. It's when you give them what they want that they actually will walk away from the table. I personally will not be surprised if the Iranians walk away from the table again, because they've been taught that the longer they hold out, the more concessions they get, which I strongly believe is exactly the opposite way to treat them.
Lastly, Mr. Ambassador, very quickly, the administration has been pushing back against this consensus, expressed most visibly by, of course, your Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, by threatening, either explicitly or at least off the record, retaliation by not standing with Israel. At the Human Rights Council, perhaps, but more generally at the United Nations, in the Security Council, when the Palestinians seek recognition there. What would be the view of Israelis? Is that also a matter of consensus? It
is a matter of concern, and I think the vast majority of Israelis would view that as a very severe and damaging development if the United States would not stand with us there. There may be some radical left-wing parties who would applaud it, but they're in a tiny minority in the state of Israel. And the expectation is that the United States will stand by not just us, but by its own commitments. According to the 1993 Oslo Accords, it says explicitly there is no alternative to direct negotiations to reach a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The Palestinians are now moving unilaterally through the UN to achieve statehood without giving us peace. They're going to use that status not to get a better two-state solution, but to go to an international criminal court and sue us for war crimes and sanction us. And those sanctions are not designed to get peace. They're designed to take us down, to destroy our economy. They're a strategic threat. So the United States should stand by its own commitments, by its own long-standing principles. Here I speak not just for myself and my party. I think I speak for the majority of Israelis. Mr.
Ambassador, congratulations again on your marvelous new book, Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israeli Divide. We look forward to talking with you further in the future and working with you in defeating this horrible deal with Iran. Next up, Garland Tucker, an author and business leader, will talk with us about conservative heroes and where we find them today. That and more straight ahead.